Well, welcome everyone. And I'm really excited today to be bringing one of our episodes of this channel, which is focused on bringing inspiration and imagination and information to you, focusing on especially drawing wisdom from our wounds of our histories and blessings from our generational wells, so that we broaden the context of knowing who we are by really exploring what we bring, what channels through us from our ancestry. And I'm really happy to be welcoming Michael Rubenfeld, who is a very interesting dude. A Canadian Jewish Pole, or Polish Jewish Canadian, or can, Jewish Polish Canadian, in that medley of identities that all of us carry in many ways. And Michael's a theater person for many years, a performer, a
Interesting.
producer of theater, and he's got a channel that I somehow found my way into on Polish Jewish relationships. And he and his wife, who met at this conference in Montreal called Limud, moved to Poland, of all places, where his
Well,
ancestry comes from. No, go
I
ahead.
moved to Poland. My wife
Ah,
was already living there.
she already was living there. And so
Yeah.
I'll let Michael tell that story. And they have a 5-year-old son. And welcome, Michael.
Thank
Please
you. Thank,
share.
thanks for welcoming me. Happy to be here.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe you can share some of your own historical lineage and what's brought you to living in Poland, and with your wife and son.
Sure. So I grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in Canada. Um, but my family were originally from Poland. So my grandparents on three sides were Holocaust survivors. On my mother's side, my grandmother survived the camps. On my and my grandfather survived by jumping off of a train on the way to Treblinka. And so growing up, I got that narrative, and also the narrative of Poland, which is a narrative that a lot of Jews have, which is usually very negative. Um, and so I just grew up being taught to hate Poland, hate Polish people, understanding that at some point I would have to, face the camps, as if it were my duty. I don't know why I felt I had to do that, but that was, I think a lot of Jews feel that way. Uh, I understood later that I think that it had to do with mourning, and I still believe that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, but I just never wanted to go. I never really wanted to go. Uh, until basically I'm a theater artist. I work in the theater, and I'm not only am I an actor, I'm a creator. I call myself a creator because I don't just write, I make things. Often that involves writing plays and writing text, but I'll do much more than just that. And I went through a period where I was not working with actors. I myself am a trained actor. That's my history. But I went through this period of wanting to work on things theatrically, on problems that seemed untenable.
Hmm. Take
Things
on
that
the
I didn't.
little stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I had made one play about, with about working with a quadriplegic woman, looking sort of at my own stereotypes
Hmm.
in relationship to disability, and that was quite life changing. And that was a 5 year, 5, 6, 7 year journey. And then that process ended, and I wanted to kind of continue on. And I thought I should tackle the relationship problems that I had with my own mother. We used to be very close, and then at a certain point, we stopped being close, and I felt incredibly disconnected from her. And I was worried that might never end, that feeling of disconnect from her. And I had a theory that the disconnect that we had from Poland, which was our country of origin, this place that we're from, might have something to do with the disconnect that we had with each other.
Hmm. Yeah, well, that comes right at the constellation of tracking these patterns, and that's a really brilliant insight around that how somehow you're able to connect those and see
Hmm.
the connectedness between the disconnects of the wounds of our own family histories and the alienation that you felt.
Yeah, and certainly, it was something that was ingrained in me my entire life. That, although we were from this place, we didn't identify as being from Poland.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
if anything, I felt like we were from Auschwitz, to be honest, because my
right.
grandmother was an Auschwitz survivor, and it just sort of felt like
Yeah,
there was nothing before that. It was like the version of the Jews that we were was
yeah,
born in Auschwitz.
yeah. How many Auschwitz survivors were there? Not many.
Not many, yeah. I mean,
So yeah, the
three.
versions, yeah, that speaks, of course, to my story as well. My dad was a survivor of Buchenwald and Death
Mm.
March, and fortunately, my dad and
Wow.
his three sisters all survived.
Oh, wow.
Grandparents were murdered, but they they were born in a shtetl called Klabutsk, and maybe you know that's just outside of Czestochow. And
It's Czestochowa? I
yeah,
don't know it.
a
No.
small little shtetl, and they all survived and married Holocaust survivors, moved to Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I was born and raised.
Oh, wow. Wow. Actually, my wife knew a family. There was an important Jewish family for her family, excuse me, in Cleveland. But I forget their name.
Well, Beechwood is the town that my parents still live, 95 and 89, and
Oh,
they stay
wow.
in
Wow.
Beechwood. Beechwood's about 80% Jewish. So
Okay.
basically, it was already populated, Ohio was already populated by Jews in the 1800s in the beaver trade. And I mean, in the fur trade, that's how Jews landed there. Cincinnati, of course, is where Reform Judaism began.
Mm.
But northeastern Ohio is where Cleveland was one of those bastions of settlement, like I imagine Montreal was,
Hmm.
Toronto, Philadelphia, Kansas City,
Yeah.
Los Angeles,
Winnipeg, too, certainly, where I was
Winnipeg as
born.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What do I know from Canada?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, no, it's funny. Yeah.
Mhm.
We
And my
we sound
dad, sorry.
Oh no, I was talking about the like there's a yeah, there's a real kind of divide sometimes between Canadians and Americans. Like our yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah, we would
go
go
on.
up into Canada, a place called Camp Cleveland that we would every summer with all these Holocaust survivors. All these Holocaust survivors came to Cleveland after the war. And so when you said, so Beechwood, I'll tell you this just briefly. Yeah, this irony that I learned over the last couple of years. Elizabeth Rosner is a writer. She writes a book called Survivor Cafe. I definitely recommend it. It's a really
Oh.
brilliant writer. And I
Hmm.
learned this that so Buchenwald, right? My dad survived Buchenwald. And I'll tell you a joke, Holocaust humor, I mean, I'm sure you're a maestro of that as well. When to tell it is an interesting question, of course. But so I was in
Or
Cleveland,
who or
Ohio. Huh?
or who to tell it to. Some of the jokes I know are too dark to tell to non-Jews.
This one is a pretty good one. My dad has tremendous wit. And I'm in Cleveland and my mom's all organic food and she sends my mom out for some organic whatever, banana, strawberries. He's like, Rose, they didn't have organic strawberries and bananas. That's why I left Buchenwald. They weren't serving organic food. That's dark humor to be sure, but that's my
Yeah.
dad. He
Oh
revived,
God.
doesn't consider himself a victim, says he had a bonus life. And
Uh-huh.
Buchenwald in German, Buchen is beech, like beech trees,
Oh.
Wald, forest. And I grew up in Beechwood.
Oh wow. Wow.
It's just
Wow. Wow.
so
Wow. Wow. Huh.
so
That's
that's a little
wild.
bit of isn't that crazy? I mean, it's
Yeah,
about
yeah.
80% Jewish. It's like one of the densest populations of Jewish people. Very successful village. So from the shtetl to this village that expanded where, my generation became, professionals. Parents' generation was more of the carpet floor covering. My dad's still doing floor covering in Cleveland since 1965.
Wow. Wow.
plumbers and the painters and the builders, and they built the city. Built
Wow. Wow. Amazing.
Anyway, so coming back to you and
Yeah.
your lineage.
So yeah, so I proposed to my mother that we go to Poland together for the first time and just basically see where we're from. Go do the things that we knew we needed to do, but also go to the hometowns of her parents and see if we can build some kind of contemporary relationship to this place that we're from.
Hmm.
Um, and then make a play about it, make a piece of theater about it. My mother's not an actress at all, but she acknowledged that there was a strain in our relationship, and she was at a time in her life where she wasn't doing much. She was basically retired,
Hmm.
and said, "Okay, I'll do that."
Uh,
Um,
she proposed that.
Well, I proposed. No, I proposed the idea. I mean, for her, I mean, what I realized was that I'm not a religious person, and so for me, the theater became my religion in a way. It was very important. My whole life revolves around being in the theater, and the relationships that I had that were very close usually came out of an artistic process. So I also knew that, and for the longest time, I kind of really kept those things separate, my family, my issues with my family, and
Mhm.
then like new families in the theater. And so I think I had just gotten mature enough to understand that perhaps bringing my mother also into a creative process with me was something that would also just help
Mm.
us
Yeah,
build relationship.
help you heal.
Yeah. Uh, and so she agreed. Uh, and and but we knew nothing about anything, so we started doing research about the play and about Poland, and we understood that we couldn't just go. We would need a guide because we didn't speak Polish. I speak some Polish now, but at the time we didn't speak any Polish, and we thought, it would be really interesting if that person was also Jewish. So before starting to think about Poland, we didn't really have a concept of a contemporary Polish reality at all.
Mhm.
Never mind a contemporary Polish Jewish reality, which we discovered existed, and and what we understood is that Poland was actually a growing Jewish community because post-communism, those who stayed in Poland, Jews who stayed in Poland, they did so, but often hid their Jewishness,
Started
and
coming out of the woodwork. Yeah.
and so all
Yeah,
of a sudden
I
people
want
were
to come back to
discovering.
that theme. Can I comment on that theme for a moment?
Sure, sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, I find it fascinating what you're saying about that journey and yeah, my mother, when you speak about hiddenness, I think that really strikes a chord in me. I think it's really true for all of us that there's hiddenness in us, so much secrecy, so much unknown, so much is subconscious and is in our constellations, is in our backgrounds, and is hidden from us. And then there's conscious hiding. So my mom was a hidden child. Like she hid as a child in Warsaw.
Mm.
Her mother and her had escaped from Rzeszów, where her father had died, and much of her family she lost. Her
What were
mother,
they doing in What were they doing in Rzeszów?
they had been ghettoized from. They had. My mother is from Leszno, is where she was born, and Kalisz is where they lived.
Uh-huh.
And her father was a manufacturer of shoes. Her mother was a saleswoman who had some sisters. They were seamstresses, very, very elegant and very successful. They actually lived in a palace, a palatial place. In '86 is when I went back to Poland with my parents. I
Oh, wow. What a
inspired.
time to go back to Poland.
Yeah,
Interesting.
Jaruzelski was there. There was communist rule. I felt the inspiration. I started studying this stuff like generational trauma and history like in 1980. I was in social work school. I was studying generational lineage. I worked genealogy, genograms with Murray Bowen was an inspiration, a family systems maestro, and sort of interviewed my aunts, interviewed my uncles, I interviewed my parents to find out information about their stories, their background stories.
That's great. That's great that you were able to have the insight to be able to do that while they were all alive.
Insight and inspiration. I was so moved. Like you said, why did you feel compelled to go to the camps? Well, I felt compelled to access that data. And I very much encourage people to ask their grandparents if they're alive, ask their elder aunts and uncles, ask their parents before they've passed. So those stories are living stories, right? Our Torah, our tradition, it's living stories, the Talmud, and these stories become reinterpreted
Mm,
as they are absorbed and passed along the generations. So in
mm, mm.
86, I just felt moved. Let's go to, my mother and father hesitantly agreed. My mother, I think, was more interested. My dad was like, why would I want to go back there? But
Sure.
my mother there was a woman, so she grew up there in college for her first 3, 4 years, and then they were taken away when the Blitzkrieg happened and the Nazis came in. And she has some vivid memories. My mom's like an incredible set of memories. And then they escaped from Rzeszów and left her father. It's a powerful story. I may tell it now, or I have a video on that of her and her mother escaping through like a cemetery, outhouse they stayed in overnight, where the cemetery keeper let them hide. And then there was a man in Warsaw, a Polish man named Adam Jacques, and his daughter Hanka, and they took in my grandmother and my mother and hid, risking their lives, hid my grandmother. My grandmother pretended to be a housekeeper, had false papers. And my mother, Hanka, was like 6 years older. My mom was like 5. Hanka was like 10 or 11. And my mother hid in closets, they went to farmhouses. She almost like converted to Catholicism. There's one beautiful picture of her where she was happy because she thought she would be converting, and she had to pretend she wasn't Jewish. Some Polish anti-Semites, and there are a few. There's a bit of that. We'll get to that subject of anti-Semitism. But at the same time, here's this Polish woman and her father that completely risked their lives to protect my grandmother and my mother. And here we are
Mm.
having this conversation. And the Russians came in and finally, and cleared out the Nazis, and my mother was liberated and remembers that. She played the Hungarian Rhapsody by heart, and she remembers the Russians coming in. They didn't harm her, and they uh, played music, and the Haganah whisked them away out of Poland on the other side over to Munich, which is where she was in school for some time. So Hanka was invited to come and declined, and Adam Jacques was in love with my grandmother and my
Oh.
posed, and then yeah. I know that there are many Polish heroes
Hmm.
and are pro-Semites, we might say, that honor and remember and felt very much, the suffering and feel the loss as well. So, and my parents met in a bakery in Cleveland, Ohio, and my dad was told, "Hey, let her have her climb the ladder so you can see her butt." So
Oh
that's the
God.
story of my lineage. So just to share that
Wow.
and
I
come
was
back.
asking partly about Rzeszów because I actually one of I think the next pieces of theater I'm going to make will probably be in Rzeszów at a
I hear
theater
that
there.
it's NATO based now, is what I heard, and I heard that the town is rather dour. That someone that was there gave me a report, and that's on the border of Ukraine. And
You know, I've never even been. I just know that the director that I work with is making a show there, and he's invited me to make a show with him there. So,
have my mom there. She's a storehouse of information. She's obsessed, my mom, with Holocaust.
uh-huh.
Holocausting the verb. Like
Wow,
every day is Holocaust Memorial Day for my mother. And
wow,
she talks, they go out and do talks. There's a documentary film that was made on our family. I'm in it. My son is
wow,
in it. And my
wow.
son actually gets a tattoo of my father's
Oh, he was one of those. Interesting.
he did one of those. So
How
that's
did you feel? How did you feel about it?
I felt um odd, really. And my father, he had talked with my father first, and my father felt honored. And I
Hmm.
feel
Interesting.
I feel a strong sense, I guess it's pride or fulfillment or this lineage, the legacy moved on. I feel like I've been a bridge. That's honestly how I feel is
Mm,
as a bridge and sharing these
interesting.
stories and having them constructing these as teaching stories. In your case, as theater. So let me let you continue.
Mm. When just as a side note, when I read that this was what people were doing, were getting tattoos, their grandparents' tattoos. I had a very strong reaction to it, and I really felt like, oh, I would do that. I would do that, and I didn't, obviously, but a lot of people didn't understand that impulse to do it.
Yeah, yeah, there were
Uh,
very mixed feelings as to the film. And to, I mean, not to the, but to that part of the film, to what my son
sure,
did.
sure.
Many positive, and if you like, what,
Yeah,
aghast.
yeah. I
I
mean, it's
understand the impulse.
extreme. Yeah,
It's powerful, that kind of remembrance. Yeah, in our bodies, uh,
sure.
how the Holocaust lives in our bodies, and how that gets passed down. My son and I are in therapy now. I don't know if he'd like me to reveal that, but we're doing a lot of healing. He's 29, lives up in Portland with his partner, and we're working that through. We see the generations, right? Your son, you have a 5-year-old son, and how that shapes in him ultimately. But let me come back a little bit to that story.
Sure, sure. So in the process of learning about these hidden Jews, we felt like, wow, it would be so interesting if we could have a guide who was also one of these hidden Jews. And we managed to find someone, a woman named Katkareshka, who actually wrote a book called Return of the Jew about this phenomenon. It was her thesis, so it reads like a thesis, but it's a very well researched book, and it's very worth reading.
We'll put that in the text below. Yeah,
Sure. And so the three of us, as well as my creative partner at the time, a woman named Sarah Garden Stanley, I raised the money and we went to Poland. And but before we had gone somewhere in that process, I had gone to this Limud conference in Montreal to talk about the fact that I would be going, and that's where I met my now wife Magda, who is a Jew, was living in Warsaw, was working on contemporary Polish Jewish subjects. She herself had started a progressive Jewish community in Kraków and Warsaw, and was doing some education. She was and continues to be an extraordinary person, and so she was invited to be a kind of feature presenter. And yeah, it was interesting kismet because I was there. It was like Poland.
yeah.
Poland and like yeah, there are a lot of energy.
Uh,
Poland became a real binding force between us.
mm,
And I but we ended up doing this trip with my mother, and we ended up doing the play, and the play, which I'll be happy to share with you. I have a good video of it. I think you would like it. The play, we ended up touring the play like throughout Poland 3 times, and also throughout Canada. We tried to get to America, but it's hard to tour.
in English with Polish transliteration.
Yeah. Yeah, we would do it. Yeah, obviously in Canada we would just do it in English. In Polish we would do it, and my wife, who's a freak of nature and is able to just do live translation very well. So
Wow.
she would live translate the show for people for who didn't speak English, just like in headpieces.
Uh, Tell me again about Magda, that when she stayed in Poland, her family stayed in Poland, or she moved and then came back? Tell me
Now, her
again.
family had always stayed. So Magda actually converted to Judaism 8 years before she and I had met. Her story is quite interesting because she had always imagined she would leave Poland. First, she felt no real connection to Poland until she started getting involved in Jewish memory and Jewish community. Uh, she just kept being drawn to Jewishness, and she discovered like all of her boyfriends had Jewish roots. And she just didn't, it was not something that was necessarily planned, but it was as if it became this calling for
Uh,
her.
right.
And so she got very, very involved.
Mm,
At this point, it was all volunteer based.
mm,
And then at some point, someone suggested, you could go a lot further if you just convert.
uh,
And
wow.
she
Powerful.
ultimately made that decision
Uh,
and got, and she got very involved. And she said, for her connection to
yeah.
Poland is through Jewishness.
Jewish
Uh,
memory. I love that concept. And just to share, I am very involved in this community of where we practice practices of the Thomas Hübel. He's a teacher that is Austrian by origins and then lives in Tel Aviv now and married an Israeli woman. And he's a brilliant teacher. He's a maestro of it's basically a meditation practice where we
mhm,
ground in our bodies and sensations. I'm a somatic therapist.
mhm,
We tune into intuitively what's in the heart, what's in our emotional bodies. We open up what's in the information in our mind, creating space, and then also connect to the relational field. So it's really a four-part synchrony. And I was in a training, ancestral lineage trauma healing training about a year and a half ago, and it was just I recommend the Thomas Hübel. You listen to podcasts. He speaks a lot about transparency, transparent
mhm.
communication, emergent futures, really revelatory and very intimate. We uh,
Can you spell how do you spell it? Thomas
Hubl, yeah, Thomas
Hubl. Ah, okay.
Hübel. And so we have cohorts. Sometimes there are trios, triads. Sometimes there are larger groups. And I met there was a group of us that were all meeting from Eastern European origins. And some of us live there. In fact, there's a Magda in Warsaw, and they're Hungarian. There are some of us that were from have ancestors from Lithuania. Some still live there. Some are Jewish, some not. Some live in America and have the ancestral roots. And we
Mm,
meet once a month, and it's so intimate.
mm,
Magda in Warsaw, maybe I'll, connect you and your Magda and this Magda. She starts to speak, and I start to cry.
mm,
Like her grandfather was there. She started talking about the trees, that her grandfather would see. And I started to tear because those are the same trees that my grandmother and my mother were visiting. And she really is like the reflection of what it was like for Polish people to have Jews to go through what they went through and to then have also the Jewish absence after Jewish generations, right? Centuries of Jewish presence in Poland, where we were hosted. I'm grateful now for Poland and for Polish hosting
mm,
for better and for worse, whatever those relationships and dynamics were, and those are complex. I'll have you come back to speak to that, which is really one where you are primarily channeling information. Um, I have now a great appreciation, and,
mm,
and partly because of Hanka and Adam Jacques, and then from other Poles that I've met that have this affinity. I have a client who's Polish. I'm going to have her tell her story. I immediately felt affinity with her. There's a
mm,
resonance to me that comes from the land. I
mm,
study the migration patterns. We have the lands that we come from in our
mm,
bodies, and we can
mm.
access via the land our cultures, our lineage histories. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I believe that. I mean, I was very surprised when I started coming to Poland to sort of understand what this land is and was.
Mhm,
Also too for like the Jewish people, because I have this relationship to the Jews as being very much city folk,
mhm.
because
Yeah,
the New York stereotype,
yeah,
Toronto, like but then coming to Poland and actually like just seeing what a beautiful country this is.
yeah. I'm
Uh,
drawn. Yeah. My dad, of course, is from the country. He would go with his father. They were the kosher. They worked with the butchers and they had the butcher shop. So they fed their family.
mm,
And my grandfather, Mordecai, whom I'm named after, They'd go and choose out the cows. My dad would, like, measure the cows, how much meat there would be. He would ride the cows back and befriend them, and they would be slaughtered. And the analogy uh, doesn't
Yeah,
pass
sure.
without an observation there. But yeah, my grandfather would squirt, milk into, my dad's mouth and his sister's mouth. And so very
Mm,
much from the country. I went back in '86 with them, as I was saying, and we went to the house, to the place in college that my parents, that my mother had lived in. And it was palatial. This was like half of the house, half of the place was huge. And we went in, we met the people that lived there. We had tea with them. They were very warm and friendly.
mm,
But we did experience some anti-Semitism there in college from some of the youth that were there. So, yeah, I went back with them in '86, went back to, we traveled with Hanka and her family. We
mm,
traveled with this,
mm.
this woman, and she's been
Wow.
honored, and Jacques been honored in Yad Vashem. And there's a man named Jeja, and I should connect you to as well. And he's in Poland. He's Polish man, and he has memorialized grandparents and created memorials like out of the goodness of his heart. This man is a spirit brother. I love
Mm,
him so much. He's just this man who is out of the spirit goodness of his spirit has gone to places, created, like, found tombstones, and created memorials to some of my grandparents and
wow.
uh, other family and friends. So uh, we then went to my father's hometown, Kalish. I mean, sorry, Kibbutz, and I was almost arrested. I had a video camera. I was taking video. We were at a schoolhouse, and
Hmm.
someone must report us. All of a sudden, two guys grab me on both sides, and they pull us into the police station. And Hanka's just pissed off at these, why they would bring us in. And they say to
Sure.
my dad, "Where are you from?" And he looks out the window and he points. He goes, "That house over there."
Uh-huh.
And
That's funny. Did your father, did they own the thing or were they rent? Did they own the house in college?
they own the house. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
there's that, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because this is a thing a lot, it's still very much a contemporary tension of Jews returning to Poland.
Hmm.
A lot of
Yeah,
people there's a lot of like legal issues still with people who have property that would have original Jewish owners. And so there's a lot of fear that people have when
yeah,
Jews, show up. So it's interesting that
yeah.
they show up for tea. I wonder if there was any part of
Yeah,
them
they
that was,
didn't own that one. They owned the shtetl, in Klobutsk they did. And I think that my aunt has the title. My dad says, yeah, your Aunt Esther had the title somewhere, and my cousin may have that. And I have no desire to reclaim, this little village house, that was, smallish and had like three generations of Gelbarts, in there. But it was very powerful to visit. And then we went to Auschwitz and did our memorializing. And I loved what you said, Jewish memory. 'Cause I think that really does go to the roots of how important zachor, how important memory is, how
Mhm,
important
mhm.
returning is, and completing this cycle. So for me, when I got to Warsaw, when I got to Poland, I landed, I spat on the ground. And I think that was my anger and my rage, and somehow it was directed into the ground. I read James Michener's book on Poland when I was there, and that's when I started to shift my perspective and look
Mm,
at Poles as also having suffered so much, and looking at them as this is the land we came from, and of course visiting with Hanka and her family and their warmth. So that did shift very much my perspective, and into
yeah,
now
well, this is a very
years later.
these are very important topics. I mean, they're topics that I touch on a lot myself. Um, to go into them, I could sort of finish up on my story, and then we could sort of
Yes.
touch on it. But basically, after having made the play with my mother, which became about us trying to to find connection, to try and put pieces back together. And also with Katka was in the play as well, and was also about a kind of reconnecting
Mm.
pieces with her. So she became an important piece of this triad between the three of us. The last image of the play is the three of us lying in a bed together with my mother sort of cradling us both.
Wow. Wow.
Uh, and But that was sort of like the beginning of the journey in a way, because Magda, my wife and I started a crazy long distance relationship between Poland and Toronto, or between like Warsaw, Krakow, and Toronto, where I was living at the time. And she would spend, a couple months in Canada. I would spend a couple months in Poland. And eventually we decided we would get married and we had to choose a country. And Magda did not really like Canada. She found it too superficial. I think she was just so used to living in a country
Yeah.
that lives with history, with its
History.
history.
Yeah.
And she just sort of found people like polite, but kind of like superficial. She said, everyone says we should get together and do something, and then no one ever actually wants to do that. They just say that.
I think of America like a sideways cross, very, very, very wide, not so deep. Whereas Europe is like this cross, very, very vertically deep,
Oh,
not as expansive, in its
yeah, well,
tolerance or openness or its boundaries being tighter. Just my uh, interpretation of that.
yeah, I mean, there's something sometimes, I mean, for me, my feeling of being in America versus Canada are two
Yeah,
very different things. I feel
yeah.
much calmer in Canada than I do in America. I feel very anxious in America.
Diasporic. Well, we're also here touching on the topic of diasporic Jews, Judaism, and European Judaism, and of course Israeli Judaism, which is a topic I would like to get to, is the distinctions of identity, which is very fascinating to me, is like how we hold all these different identities. And of course, assimilation, such a powerful force in the galut, in the exile or the distance from the source land, and
Mhm.
that's so deeply in our bodies. Exile, the sense of being outsiders, of course, being hosted by other countries, the tension between assimilation and sustaining of our cultures. I have felt that so deeply embodied in myself growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, where there were Jews that were Reformed, there was conservative, there was Orthodox, different denominations. And then there were Holocaust survivors who came in to that land and that embodied in different ways, both in terms of the sustaining of traditions. Like my family, my dad has three sisters, and my uncles, who were all badass Iron Holocaust survivor men, they stayed very close. My dad and his sisters were bonded so
Mm.
deeply. We would meet at talk about kosher butcher history. We would meet at Chinese restaurants every Sunday night and have sweet
Mm.
and sour pork and shrimp and lobster sauce. It was
Right.
crazy. And
Yeah.
my grandfather
Well,
Mordecai was like, "Oh my God, how do you?" But I'm like, "Grandpa, bacon, it just smells so good." It's those assimilationist forces. And yet every Passover we'd celebrate together who made the best gefilte fish, who
mhm.
made the best egg noodles. And we had these traditions that were very powerful. And I think that's in terms of the diaspora, one of the
Mhm.
most powerful forces and successes and blessings and how Jewish people sustained culture was we bounded together. We created Jewish community centers. We created synagogue life. We created memorials, Holocaust memorials. There's one in Cleveland that actually was nationally honored recently, all the way Biden to Biden's desk. A cousin of
Mm.
mine helped move that forward. It's called Zion Cemetery in Cleveland.
Mm.
There's
Yeah, I
ashes
mean, those are
that
really
are there.
powerful. I agree with you, and those are things that I think that I maybe growing up took a bit for granted. I didn't feel a deep I didn't really want to have anything to do with Jewishness growing up. And
Mhm,
I think it's partly because there was just like so much trauma, unresolved trauma in my family
for sure.
that that
Mm-hmm.
It's like, the way that Jewishness was offered to me through my family was, it didn't bind me to it. I went to Jewish school. I didn't like it. I didn't feel like this feeling of closeness, which is partly, like the stereotype of Jewish families that they're so close, but it was almost like there was just too much trauma for those bonds to
Yeah,
occur. And it
for
wasn't
sure.
really until I started coming to Poland, to be
Yeah.
honest, started to actually feel a deeper connection to
For
Jewishness.
sure, very common in terms of the assimilationist tendencies. And yeah, I was sent to Orthodox Hebrew school. Why my mother sent me there? We didn't live Orthodox in the home.
Mm,
She chose to send me. And one of the things I think I got from that was the prayers, the songs, the chant.
yeah.
Like that's very deep in me. I heard these old, survivors, European, like the actual mamash, the language. But I rebelled like hell against Hebrew school. I was like, forget it. So I was very like rebellious at the same time,
Mm,
just barely conforming. And
mm,
there was and that struggle in me continued between religiosity. I wound up studying psychology and religious studies at University of Michigan, got my master's
mm,
degree there. So there's a fascination more from sociological, from cultural, anthropological, sort of wider angle view at this whole phenomena of religion. And yeah, Judaism, we kind of like, gave birth to Christianity and Islam, and that hasn't done great for the world. So how much blame do we get, it's kind of turning the topic a little bit,
mm.
for having, invented this, whether we invented it or
Monotheism.
given it, bigger topic, of course. But so I had that tension very much. And it wasn't until I went to Israel as a sophomore in college, I lived in Jerusalem for about 14 months. And I was in a yeshiva. I actually moved into the old city. I had been at Hebrew University, 1 year program, and I
Mm,
left. Several of my decisions there were made on cannabis. To go to Israel in the first place as a sophomore, leave Ann Arbor, to go into yeshiva, which was a wild choice on my part, and
mm.
almost become a rabbi. Like I went over on the pendulum over there. And
Wow.
so at the same time, couldn't give up cheeseburgers and came back to America and got my degrees.
It was just cheeseburgers. Cheeseburgers was the obstacle. I actually wrote a play once about a man whose father has just died and he's kept kosher his entire life, but he's had a tension between his father about keeping kosher. And in a crisis moment at the funeral home, he locks himself in a funeral office with a cheeseburger. And he has a whole conversation with the cheeseburger. The cheeseburger can talk. His name is Barry. And the whole thing starts with like, do it, eat me. You know you want to. Just do it.
That's
Yeah.
great. I
Yeah. So that's
get that
really
you
fun.
understand these. This is such a, I felt a resonance from the first that I watched your videos of like how deeply you've turned towards that. And so the similarities and differences, the superficiality and yet the depths, the traumas and how like, my cousins, the proportions I've heard in terms of the attraction to Jewish identity and to healing the trauma are like a third and a third and a third. A third go deeply into that. We become the therapists or the theater people or the artists or the interviewers and such of that generation.
Mm.
And then a third are ambivalent about it. And a third is like don't with a 10-foot pole. Like I have no interest in going there in terms of our relationships with generational trauma.
Yeah. Well, for me, I felt such a burden. I felt so burdened with generational trauma, and I just wasn't so interested in the burden anymore. I got really kind of sick of it. And part of like the play was also about like how can I unburden myself? Done a lot of therapy, a lot of really great and interesting therapy stuff, and I'm still in therapy and I love therapy, but I'm such an actor, like in the sense of things. Like I need to act. I need action.
Yeah.
And I sometimes, and I just felt like I was spending a lot of time working on or releasing emotions, past traumas, but I just felt like it
Yeah.
was just like I wanted to do more. I needed to be active, and when
Yeah.
the when
and
my wife and I decided to
creative.
marry,
Creative and imaginative and
creative,
theatrical is
generative.
transforming the stories, even transforming these stories. And it's such a powerful way to do that. I almost went into acting like this close. I definitely have some of that. That's why I tell these lineage stories. How do we take the stories, the raw material, like Hamotzi Lechem in arts? How do we take this raw material and transform that into valuable blessings and insights and inspiration for others? I feel aligned with you in that.
Yeah, or even yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I mean, this is why Poland started to make sense because even like as an actor, like I don't really define as an actor as much as I do as a maker or
Hmm.
like a cultural architect or a social scientist
Cultural architect. Love it.
because for me, like for me, the art project, I think of my life as an art project, but the art project was what carried me ultimately to Poland, where it's like if I really want to sort of focus
Mhm.
on on the trauma in I'd have to move to like the belly of the beast in a way, and so
Ah,
that's why it made sense to come here um
yeah.
and work on it from here. And while acting is part of what I do, when I first moved here, my wife and I, we started a Jewish arts and activist festival and organization. And we work as actors. My wife is an activist. We work, I work as an artist. We make a festival. We have a festival in 3 weeks that starts.
Ah,
And and what we needed to sort of find ways to change to change realities, also in like practical ways, and also to like rebuild relationship because there's a lot of fractured relationship here in Poland
in
and
general, between Poles as well, in
between
general.
Poles and well, yeah, I mean the thing about Poland, right, is that this is a traumatized country, and there's a lot of shared trauma here from the same event, right? The Second World War traumatized the Jewish people and the non-Jewish Polish people, and that's something that everyone
Yeah.
has history from here.
And they
Poland.
stayed on the land, which is its own trauma. Like they stayed in the trauma zone. We kind of got out. Never thought of it in that angle, but we
Yeah,
got distance from it.
yeah.
And, and whereas I do feel this sympathy and empathy for Poles, the next generations, especially, of how that got passed down. And so that fracturedness is something that you can feel there, huh?
Well, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, like it defines the Polish identity, and then there's also the contemporary Polish Jewish identity, because there's very much a vibrant contemporary Polish Jewish identity. 15, 20,000 Jews,
Now
and in
that
fact,
started to revive in what, the 90s or in the 2000s that
yeah, it
there,
started in the 90s. It started in the 90s. I don't know how much you know about the history of Jews in Poland, but like the first wave of Jews, the real first wave of Jews left in 56. A lot of Jews left in 56. And then in 1968, I don't know how much you know about 1968, what
yeah,
happened here. But in
Czechoslovakia's
68,
rebellion or what? What happened then?
sorry, no, it wasn't about Czechoslovakia at all. It was basically, it had more to do with the 6 Day War in Israel.
Uh,
So after the 6 Day War in Israel, where of course Israel won the 6 Day War, but the people backing the Arabs were the Russians. The Americans were backing Israel, but communist Poland was also controlled by Russia,
I,
and basically, as a punishment, the communist Polish government basically said to Jews, you're either Polish or you have to either align with
uh,
Poland or with Israel.
uh,
You can't do both.
Interesting.
And and that was like what was spoken, but really like in and around this period, Jews were being kind of kicked out of their position, kicked out of academia. If you weren't, Jews became persona non grata in Poland, and then
Oh,
they were invited to leave Poland with $5 in there on a one-way. They were given a one-way pass to leave Poland in
no
1968 by the.
wonder the resentments. I mean, that also fed some of the resentments. In your comments, as I read the comments on your videos, some of them are informative, and the many and some that are so violently, like that one anti-Semitic, like that one, the video you did on reconciliation. I read some of those comments, like, oh, just
Yeah.
aghast at the horrifying extremism of some of the anti-Semitic notions that are spoken in there. So, and we can understand resentments, of course, and how trauma lands in different people, in people's bodies in different ways, and the extent of the trauma, and trauma does fracture. So when you talk about fracturing and breakage, that's what trauma does, right?
Mm,
And
mm,
so it doesn't surprise me, and these tensions that exist between, in that case, also Russia, Soviet Union. And I'm fascinated. Anytime I meet like a Russian Jewish person, I'm like, tell me your story, please. Like,
mm.
feel an affinity. Like, what it was like to have to hide Judaism, like the Moranos, in Spain, having to hide, and yet the memories and the genetics and the epigenetics and the stories just like go underground and continue to stream through us, and we
Mm.
dip back into that stream, and yet it can be again so hidden. So Russian Jews that didn't have the practices, didn't grow up with Judaism, and
Yeah.
preserve their identities in such fascinating and diverse ways.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true.
How it plays out.
And the Polish, the contemporary Polish Jew, meaning like, after communism, people started to learn that they were Jews, but not all Jews left. There were a lot of Jews who did stay after 68, but kind of organized Jewish community ended. But there were still Jews who stuck around. A
Back
lot
into
of them,
hiding.
not necessarily in hiding, but they just kind of decided, no, we're going to stay. They became,
Mm,
they were atheistic enough,
mm,
maybe not practicing enough.
mm.
Not they didn't necessarily say they weren't Jewish, but they were like, no, we're going to just stay. Somehow they were able
Poles
to. Yeah,
identified more lean to the polarity of pole.
yeah, or like they were okay with their Jewishness not being sort of the lead on their identity. Sometimes if
Right.
they were this, it didn't really necessarily affect their practices. A lot of people who worked in academia or in politics, they just like they couldn't make things work, but other people were somehow able to fly under the radar. Every story is
Yeah.
unique,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, that like, being Jewish was still not a great thing during this period. And then after communism, when people started to learn that they were Jewish, and a lot of people, choosing to embrace their Jewishness, you know, this is a really particularly interesting circumstance of people now living on this genocidal land, because it's the Jews, because the Polish people didn't experience what I would call a genocide, but the Jews did.
Mm.
And so this is a really
Genocidal land. That's a very powerful phrase.
and in fact, what was very interesting for me is that when I started to
I
learn
want to
more.
sit with that for a moment. Like that just
Sure.
really lands in me, like calling that phrase, like really,
Mm,
'cause that feels really like, yeah, that really is a way to describe my sense of Poland, of my connection, and how you're describing that difference. For Poles, it wasn't genocidal. For Jews, it was, and it's such a powerful description of where the twain don't meet, where the twain meet and where they don't, in
mm,
terms of that tension between cultural tensions. Well, we lived in our shtetls, and my grandfather, they would sell meat, non-kosher meat. They would divide with the non-kosher butchers. They would, they correlated. They did business together. They coexisted. Very much. The Gelbart family coexisted with Poles, and so did
sure,
my
sure.
mother's family. So that emphasizing that coexistence, those stories are very important. Yeah.
Absolutely. And now we're just talking about shtetls, but in cities, in larger cities,
Yeah.
coexistence was really common. And there were movements there were Jewish nationalist movements
Yeah.
encouraging Jews to become more Polish, to
Yeah.
so
Yeah, the college history, actually. I read something recently. I think I may have referenced the book to you. There's interesting history there where there was a very strong Jewish contingent in college, urban
mhm,
contingent, and there was this relational dynamic in terms of the political and the economic realms and how that played out over several hundred years or
sure.
hundred years or so.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
these are
yeah.
of course urban. Many Gelbart started to, move to Lodge or, or Woods, would that be? I think the
Huge, yeah.
pronunciation. Uh,
Huge.
got to work on my Polish. By the way, sidebar is that I'm applying for Polish citizenship. Like I'm about
Okay.
8/10 of my way there. I haven't finalized, and it's an interesting little bit of a struggle there of like, why am I doing this? Like, well,
Ah,
I'm reclaiming, I'm reconnecting, I'm remembering. There's something that feels right about, of course, EU status is a nice fringe benefit. Like it
mhm,
does, there's a sense of I belong, like there's something in me that belongs there.
mhm, mhm.
I think you mentioned about the sort of superficiality of America and Cleveland, and now I'm in California. And where is home? Where are roots? And there are
Well,
roots. So,
this is the thing about Poland is like, if you are an Ashkenazi Jew, this is the contemporary Jewish homeland. 70% of Europe's Jews were living in Poland before the war. And Poland, for the longest time, was the center of our histories. And when I started coming here and started hooking into these histories and learning about these histories, I this is where a kind of real sadness started to emerge because I went to a Jewish school until about grade 6. I grew up in a Jewish family. I was taught I was taught Torah and Talmud, like I was taught these stories, and then I was taught about the Holocaust, and then I was taught about the formation of the state of Israel and everything up until then.
yeah.
But there is like a 2,000 year gap that I wasn't taught anything about. And I didn't know that Jews were living in Poland for 1,000 years, and importantly, for 700 years. I didn't know that the version of the Jew that I am originated here. The trauma of the Holocaust was so intense that it cut off our ability to think of ourselves as
Yeah.
Polish people,
Yeah.
but we are Polish. Like I also got my citizenship and I reclaimed it through my deceased grandfather because that felt really important to me. And I didn't get it. I just proved it. So
Mhm.
I
Yeah. Yeah.
working.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I like that. I like that. That's right. Yeah, when I was in my was in the 1980s when I was interviewing, I think it was at my dad's like 80th birthday celebration in Florida, where several of my aunts and uncles had migrated, so to speak. And I felt this desire to interview them about their childhoods before the war. I didn't want their Holocaust stories. I wanted their what was it like to be in the shtetl? What was it like to grow up in Kibbutz?
Mm,
And they started just sharing the stories. You know how memory works, it's collective. And so they just fed each other's memories. And so I have this video of them talking about the
mm,
pre-existing. I also love the stories of Shalom Aleichem, Fiddler on the Roof, and all these shtetl stories. That does feed that in me. And seeing the like Roman Vishniak and some of those old photos, like in the Holocaust Museum in DC, there's that, column of like 3 stories of photos of the pre-existing life. I think those stories are so important to revive. And it's so important to reclaim our history, not just the land, but our histories, as you're describing that pre-existing conditions, of that to repair. And that's very much about trauma repair, right? It's recovering through the trauma, but the courage is going back through the trauma.
Yeah. Yeah.
Explain.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big wall. It's a really intense wall.
It is a really intense wall,
But I
and
do think that as we get further from it, yeah, like I think it'll be much easier. I'm sure it's easier for your son, and it'll be easier for your son's children, and it'll be easier for my child, than the subsequent generations. Like I think that trauma wall that I have decided to sort of try and move past couldn't have been done by my mother and her family.
mm,
It has it like I think it could, it's a lot easier to start from my generation and then
I'll
subsequent
tell
generations.
you, I'm gonna just give a shout out to my mom, Rose Gelbart. She's Rosa Grossman was her name, and she has done the work.
Mm,
Like she's been Holocausting for decades. They go to the Holocaust conferences. She helped start this whole, now it's
mm,
called International Hidden Children, uh,
mm,
uh, children survivors. And we go to these conferences. I went this last year in DC. I've gone to about 5 or 6. I think my mom's gone like 25, drags my dad to the conferences. And they've shared their stories. They've shared their stories. I'm like, Mom, who's actually listening? You
mm,
listening, you're all telling their stories. And they've done a lot of healing. Saturday nights, we have these dances, I've
mm,
danced in Cleveland in this old building called the Terminal Tower. I led a workshop, a dance movement workshop. I'm a dancer. I'm a mover. That's my healing
mm.
form. And led this like 5 rhythms dance movement therapy in the basement of the Terminal Tower in Cleveland with all these Holocaust survivors. And we just had so much joy. Like I do find that the deeper we go into the grief, the deeper we heal the trauma, the more the joy, the more
Mm.
expansiveness that comes from that. So turning towards the storm like buffaloes rather than turning away is just
Yeah.
some for buffalo. And not everyone is brave, but my mother is incredibly courageous. She
Good girl.
remembers details of her child, and she tells those stories with so much strength. And
Mm,
now, finally, and I have battled with my mom through the years. My nervous system wiring is just like my mom's. And
mm,
in the film, my mother said she froze then and she's still frozen. And
mm, mm.
melting that ice has been, how do you be compassionate attuned when you've had such a woundedness in your own childhood? And so I've
Mm,
tried to save her and rescue her. And Mom, just be grateful. Look where you are. You're looking at the old age home from here. You're not looking here from the old age home. And this
mm,
remonstrating with her and just and that's healed a lot these last years as I've done my own generational healing. My mom has really
mm,
been healing as well, and I'm so
mm.
grateful that I still get to hear their stories.
Yeah,
Like
that's really
I
fortunate.
get to
And
hear my
sure.
dad's. I'll tell you one other bit here. My dad's story. So as I've done this healing and the storytelling, which is what I'm doing, is just telling these stories as wisdom teachings as much as I can draw that. And I did this like meditation where I start with meditations and when I lead circles, ancestor story circles. And the meditation just comes to me in the moment. And I sort of had this image of this egg that just sort of cracked. And the way that bringing that comes down into us from above, this what we're given, what we absorb coming down into the earth. And as I did that, I started talking about where do we come from? What villages do we come from? And I started remembering or sensing into Kibbutz, into the village, into the shtetl. And I started imagining Simchat Torah, dancing with the Torah, having Passovers there, Purim celebrations, Mordechai, right? And
Mm,
Esther is my aunt's name. And I started imagining what it was like to dance and sing. And so I told my dad that the next day. I said, Dad, I had this image. He goes, oh yeah, the cousins would come from Czestochow, and every Saturday night we'd have these, performances and shadow puppetry, and we would sing together. I'm like,
mm.
I
It's
just brought
powerful. I think this is the thing, this is the other thing is that Jews were not unhappy here. Like they were not unhappy living in Poland.
right.
There were pogroms, there were some problems, but for the most part, like Jews, and I think this is why there's so much pain connected to Poland is because Jews didn't necessarily want to leave Poland up until like 35. after Piłsudski's death, it was a place that Jews wanted to live. They were here because there were more rights given to Jews in Poland than any other place in the world when the Statute of Kalisz began, and King Kazimierz the Great started inviting Jews to Poland, and they came. They were here for a reason.
Yeah.
And this is the other thing too. I just sort of assumed that this place was a shithole, that Jews couldn't wait to get to leave, and then the Holocaust happened, and then they left. And once a shithole, always a shithole. And learning that, yeah, like actually no, like people liked it here. They liked their homes, they liked their friends, they liked living in Poland.
Yeah.
And
That's
being
a
able
super
to
important story.
reconnect to that is
Yeah.
is super important, because yeah, this for me has been, yeah, absolutely very healing, because to kind of know that like I don't come from Auschwitz. I actually come from places that people loved being
Yeah.
in. And yeah,
True.
and one of the like some of the more peaceful places for me in Poland are the cemeteries,
Uh,
because they're where I can really feel life. I can really feel life in the cemeteries of all places, because you see like the history of Jewish people who just lived lives and died these like natural lives before the war began.
yeah.
They didn't know it was coming. They just lived these sort of lives.
That's
And these
true
cemeteries,
reclaiming. That is true reclaiming. I want to say this before we finish. I want to honor our time, honor your time. I'm really drawn now. I want to come back to Poland. It's been a long time since I've wanted to. I think I will next year. And I have
right.
other Eastern European cohorts, Eastern European Jewish roots people. And I want this time, I don't want to do the Holocaust camp memorial tour. I want to visit the land. I want to see the trees. I want to be by the lakes.
Mm,
Really experience, like one person in the Jewish Wrestling for Belonging group that I'm a part of, cohort in the Hubel world. She lives in Warsaw,
mm,
and she described how, the deer, like what were Torah scrolls made of? Deer skin. In part, I imagine, deerskin, cowhide.
mm,
Well, where were those cows and deers buried? Where are they? They're in the land. They came from the land. They're in the land. And so
mm,
our Torah scrolls literally
mm,
came from Polish soil. And so much of the genius of the Talmud, so many of the great Vilna Gaon, so many of the great teachers came from the Ukraine and from that Pale of Settlement. And so
mm.
that's the reclaiming. I really appreciate that's an insight for me. It's not about Polish citizenship. It's reclaiming of that cultural history.
Yeah, I
And
really encourage it. I encourage it. When people come and they ask me about Auschwitz, I mean, I never tell people you shouldn't go to Auschwitz, because I couldn't tell people that. But I ask people to ask themselves what they're hoping to get by going there, and why do they need to be there. I've been once, and I don't feel I need to go again. And I've had a couple of people that I spoke to, and they decided, okay, maybe we're actually going to skip it, because are you going to actually get what you need out of this land by going to the camps? I still do it. I still go, and I still engaged in Holocaust memory. Ironically, my wife has a much easier time. My wife is far more engaged in Holocaust memory than I am. And I think part of it is that she is a convert.
yeah,
And she doesn't hold the same trauma in her body that I do.
sure.
And this is actually very interesting, because there are a lot of non-Jewish people working on Holocaust memory in Poland. And I think that there's an allyship
For sure.
uh,
For sure.
uh,
Like my friend
that
Yezha. I mean, he's a spirit brother. I mean, for sure. That's true. Percentages, I don't know. You would know more about it. Again, reading the commentaries in your threads, the percentages are it's the tension is felt, that fragmentation.
it's hard to know. I mean, until I started doing social media stuff, I hadn't really been exposed to much anti-Semitism. It's quite bad. I have a TikTok account as well, and it's very bad. It can get very bad on TikTok. It's less bad on YouTube. I generally find that like there's a lot of really thoughtful
Mhm.
responses.
Yeah.
to what I'm saying. And yeah, I was a bit surprised by some of the responses
They're
to,
longer videos. Yeah, I stay off of TikTok. I mean, these days, especially with Israel, social media is very dangerous to one's mental health.
yeah, it's hard.
Uh,
But I will say, it's hard when you encounter something that seems that's traumatic because it's full of anti-Semitism. But I think it's also important to also sort of fight through those emotions and also see how many people are also on the other side. Because I actually like I encounter a lot of non-Jewish Polish people who are very interested in reconciliation.
yeah,
Krakow has the largest Jewish culture festival in Europe, possibly even the world, because there is a conscious and subconscious missing of the Jew
yeah,
here in Poland. And there are a lot of people who understand that Jewish history in Poland is not exclusively Jewish history in Poland. It's
yeah.
also non-Jewish Polish history.
The interrelationships. Yes.
And that's what made me feel like it was okay to come back here, really. It was the non-Jews who are working on Jewish memory. Because if I felt like it was only the Jews, there's just not enough. There's
Yeah.
not enough Jews. But there are people who are far more engaged
I love that
in,
story of Huberman's violin, that story. Huberman's
no.
violin. Oh, I really highly recommend this to you. Josh
Hmm.
Bell gets a violin that had been stolen from Huberman, who was in the 1910s. He was like virtuoso violin player, a
Hmm.
Jewish violinist in Czestochowa. And is he actually was very instrumental in bringing these musicians, superb musicians, to Israel, and they formed like the heart of the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra. He whisked
Wow.
it away in the 30s. And
Wow. Wow.
Joshua Bell winds up with his violin and bringing it back to Czestochowa, to this music hall that was created from a former synagogue that had been desecrated by the Nazis, becomes a music hall. It's a phenomenal story. Definitely recommend Huberman's violin.
Wow. 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 Yeah, I'd love
That,
to.
well, let's have some finishing notes here.
Sure.
So much depth and resonance and in this conversation, and
Mm,
insights I know that have emerged here in me, and I hope
mm,
in you,
mm,
and hope that
mm,
those are listening. Wow, those of you that have stayed and braved, 90 minutes, kudos to you, and honor and respect. And please make comments and visit Michael's YouTube channel and TikTok if you're brave, really brave. And you know what you said, just one last note about addressing trauma and addressing even the anti-Semitism. Like, it's not coming from us, it's coming towards us, or it's when we're facing that, whatever that is that's difficult, it's so important to address. Because if we're avoiding and we're hiding, or we're fighting, or we're numbing, and all those are understandable trauma responses to protect ourselves. There's something about being able to unmelt that, and to be able to go through that fire and to emerge, more fully as we are. Just one, this is my tattoo that I decided this last year. It's a phoenix,
mm.
and
Mhm.
let's see, and what it says is emunah shamayim. Emunah means faith or belief, and shamayim is sky or fire and water, and born of the ashes and reborn. And us Jewish people, we have longevity, and we've gone through and we've survived and sustained and drawn wisdom from the wells of our wounds. And we're diviners. Jews are diviners. And so thank you so much for drawing some of your wisdom, your courage, your insight, your creativity, your imagination, your amazing history and your stories. I really respect you, and I hope that we meet maybe in person next year. And your wife also would be just wonderful to, maybe I can interview her sometime if she's interested. And this woman Katka, so please, if you would put those, you could put those in an email to me, maybe a little
Sure.
description of
Sure.
what you'd like me to put in the post. And everyone, thank you so much, and hope you can draw this into your own trauma histories and regenerate, as we're here to support one another with.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Michael. I'm
Yeah.
gonna run to go and get my son now.
Be well, enjoy your descendancy. Bye.
Thank you. Okay, bye.